Good morning, ladies. It's wonderful to be with you again. It's been 2 weeks. Brian and I took a little time off, and you had the great blessing of having Caroline Glazier teach you for those 2 weeks. I'm sure you appreciated Caroline. She's incredibly gifted, isn't she? Well, today we get to talk about Hezekiah. Now, you've been reading about Hezekiah in your scriptures and about the many things he did, mostly good. Occasionally he didn't do so well, but I want to focus a little bit about the conflict that arose between Hezekiah and Sennacherib. Sennacherib being the king of Assyria and Hezekiah being the king of Judah. This is very critical in our world history as well as our biblical history and our salvation history. And I hope as you look at this with me, you'll learn some lessons from the life of Hezekiah, and you'll understand with me how we can apply them to our lives, even though we're not kings. Now, the showdown between Judah's king Hezekiah and Assyria's king Sennacherib had to be one of the most suspenseful and absolutely terrifying, miraculous stories in the Bible. Here we have one of the most powerful military forces of the day up against, frankly, a depleted and a discouraged small kingdom, but a kingdom chosen by God, the kingdom of Judah. We have a Judean king, Hezekiah, who is notable because he's one of the few listed in the scriptures that actually did things that pleased the Lord. He was noted for his faith, even though he inherited a very weak and divided and apostate kingdom from his father Ahaz. Ahaz worshipped foreign gods, even sacrificed one of his children to Moloch, an absolute abomination for the Jews. Up against Hezekiah, we have one of the most powerful rulers of the day, the Assyrian ruler Sennacherib, who inherited a strong and a wealthy kingdom and was determined to conquer the known world. Both are convinced that God's on their side. But the good money, the trusted bet, would be on Assyria. Hezekiah ascended the throne of Judah in 715 BC. Just a few years earlier, King Sargon II, the father of Sennacherib, had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. But he had stopped there and didn't go south to Judah because Judah was willing to pay him off to stay away from their country. They were willing to be a vassal state at that time, and Sargon had other things to do. But the political turmoil caused by Sargon's death in 705 BC led Hezekiah and many of the other states around Assyria to attempt rebellion. This was an uncertain time. They weren't so sure how strong Sennacherib was going to be, and they felt this was the time to move against them and attempt to be independent. This was a typical situation because the new king was often tested by his, not so loyal subjects. King Sargon II had been a force to be reckoned with. But when Sennacherib came to his throne in 704 BC, there were revolts sprouting throughout his entire empire. Tribute stopped flowing in, and conquered people everywhere hoped that this hitherto untested monarch might prove to be no match for his mighty father, and indeed his grandfather, Tiglath-Pileser III. Babylon and Egypt were a big threat to Assyria, and these little nation states could be put on the back burner for a while, but not indefinitely. The southern kingdom was unique in that it claimed, of Judah, and it claimed to worship one God, the God that was more powerful than any God, even the God of Assyria. And King Hezekiah, among the first to rebel in 705, found that his fateful interaction between himself and his kingdom, his God, and Assyria, their kingdom, and their God, was going to absolutely affect the entire trajectory of the salvation story. So let's look at this a little bit. Hezekiah, in leading Judah in revolt, must have thought the king of Assyria had his hands full, and he was in good company. Sennacherib reigned when the Assyrian Empire was at its peak, and it had armies of over 100,000 men. This was the big force, but he still faced a formidable enemy coalition. He faced Babylon, he faced Egypt, and he faced several small kingdoms that had come together to oppose him. So it wasn't until 701 BC when Sennacherib, this is a hard word to pronounce, Sennacherib, he moved westward towards Syria. At that time, arriving in Phoenicia, he made short work of Tyre and Sidon, and messengers started flowing into Judah that Assyria was on its way. Phoenicia was the key to Mediterranean trade. Phoenicia was a pivotal city for Assyria to conquer. And believe me, the Judeans started to quake, thinking of what could happen. Now, Judah's importance to Assyria was geographic because it was located between Phoenicia and Philistia. The kingdom itself was really of negligible value. But the Assyrians believed their God had given them a mission to conquer the entire world. And who was this little city-state, this Judea, to stand up against them? They needed to be made an example of. Their rebellion couldn't stand. So Hezekiah was the one that God chose, who was on the throne of Judah at the time. Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, the 13th king of Judah, was considered a righteous king, both in the second book of Kings and the second book of Chronicles. He's one of the more prominent kings mentioned in the Bible, and he's even one of the kings mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, in the lineage of Jesus himself. No king of Judah, either his predecessors or successors, could be compared to him according to 2 Kings 18:5. He reigned between 715 and 686 BC. Fairly long reign for a king in that day. The prophets that were serving God at that time in Judah included the great Isaiah and Micah, and they advised the king many a time and helped him to make some pretty significant decisions and warned him against his follies. Often Hezekiah listened, unlike his predecessors. According to the Bible, Hezekiah witnessed the destruction of the northern kingdom by Sargon's Assyrians in 722. He knew the power of Assyria, and yet the first thing he did was enact religious reforms after he obtained the throne from his father. He ordered strict mandates that only the Lord should be worshipped. He cleansed and repaired the temple, and he prohibited the worship of other deities within the temple in Jerusalem. He had a markedly different attitude toward the Lord from that of his father. The Bible describes Ahaz's apostasies at length. He worshipped many gods. In fact, he even sacrificed one of his own children in the fire of Moloch. Ahaz is depicted as a man who went out of his way to stray from traditional religious beliefs. He is definitely not one of the model kings in Judah. And yet this son, Hezekiah, in contrast, is one of only two kings in Judah that the authors of the book of Kings praise unstintingly, the other being Josiah in the late 7th century BC. He won strong praise for his piety, and it's because of his faith that God was with him, and he went forth to war and achieved success. It was because of his faith that he sustained against a terrible attack, or at least surrounding and against him by the king of Assyria. Hezekiah was pious, but he wasn't a fool. Sometimes we think those things go hand in hand. Oh no. He believed in God, he trusted in God, but he also fortified the walls of Jerusalem, and he established for the first time a water source by building a great, amazing tunnel underneath the walls of Jerusalem to the pool of Sidon, so that his people within Jerusalem would have access to water, and the people outside who were laying siege to Jerusalem would not have access to water. This tunnel, in fact, is one of the few places where you can find an inscription. It's still there, an inscription to Hezekiah's rule in the tunnel. It's an amazing place to visit. I have not yet had the privilege. Brian has, and he describes it as one of his most significant experiences in the Holy Land. So Hezekiah strengthened the walls. He made access to water for the first time. He enlarged the walls of Jerusalem tremendously, accommodating not only the safety of his own people, but allowing for refugees to come in from all of the conquered towns around him. He also started building new weapons, and we read that he stored food. Some actual jars have been found scattered throughout ancient Judah that are dated to the time of Hezekiah that have inscriptions on them saying they belong to the king. So he was storing up food to prepare for prolonged siege. So with water and food, walls, and new weapons being built, large numbers of weapons and shields, we read in 2 Chronicles 32, the people were mobilized. They weren't sitting passively waiting for the Assyrians to show up. The preparations became very helpful because in 701 BC, sure enough, Sennacherib began his campaign against Judah and those who rebelled in the area. City after city fell. Many outposts of Jerusalem fell. In fact, that we read that there was a terrifying assault where soldiers slew nobles who provoked rebellion, hung their bodies on watchtowers. Sennacherib reported taking over 200,000 people as slaves. In a lament, the prophet Micah, in chapter 1, verse 8 to 16, lists some of the towns destroyed. Fear ran unchecked through the region. Everyone was just waiting for Sennacherib and his army to show up and wreak revenge. But records from Assyria state, even as the scripture, that Sennacherib did not capture Jerusalem, that he was only able to shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, and that was for a limited time. Now, the biblical account in 2 Kings 18 of Sennacherib's campaign to Judah began during the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign. Sennacherib mounted an attack on all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them one after the other. Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent word to the king of Syria at Lachish, one of the conquered cities, and said, "Please, I have sinned. Do not attack me. I will pay you a tax." And the king of Assyria imposed on Hezekiah 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. So where did Hezekiah get that money? Well, he took the money, the protection money, straight from the temple. He stripped even the temple doors of their gold to pay off Sennacherib, hoping that that would prevent the superior armies of the Assyrians from marching into Judah. But Sennacherib had no intention of doing that. They not only intended to march in, but to kill many people, eliminate the rulers, including the king himself. So not only did this gold and silver not prevent Sennacherib from surrounding Jerusalem, but he not only did that, but he sent a high-level delegation to parley with the king, just to basically say, you are doomed. Open up your gates, surrender now. Your people might stand a chance. Now this conversation in 2 Kings 18 to 22, between Assyrian high officials and Judean counterparts took place just outside the wall, with the people of Jerusalem listening into the conversation. And it was certainly intended as much to spread dissent and fear among the people. It was propaganda as it was negotiation. Demoralizing the public was one of Assyria's tactics. In fact, the Judean negotiators were so concerned about the things that they were hearing that they said, please, why don't you speak in Aramaic, the language of diplomacy, knowing that by doing that, the common people would not understand what was being said. But the Assyrians wisely said, no, we'll stick to your native language. And they proceeded to talk about the false confidence the people were having in this God of Israel, who could not even protect the neighboring cities. Why would he protect them? They boasted about what they had done in all the cities around them. They talked about how their God was so much stronger. And they said, you are leaning on a broken staff. You're depending on help from Egypt even, and they're not showing up, are they? You are doomed. Surrender. Well, by the time the negotiators came back and said, we're relying on the Lord our God, the Assyrian negotiators were able to say, you mean the very God whose temple has been stripped? Oh, this was just awful. It was so demoralizing. They came back to the king with a report that the Assyrians had said their God was powerless. And was he? Well, the rest of this speech continued until finally the king rends his garments when he hears the report, and he goes straight to the temple. He does not surrender in fear, but he goes straight to God. And he sends his advisors to fetch Isaiah and to tell Isaiah what's going on. Well, at this point, the situation is summed up by saying in Hebrew, the children are coming to the edge of the womb, yet the strength to give birth is lacking. Those of us who are women who are listening to this know that feeling, that final push when you're about to give birth, but you don't know if you could even do this. The child will die in the womb without that push. And this is how desperate the situation is for the people of Judah. They are surrounded by a superior force. They can only outlast a siege. They cannot fight back. So with all seemingly lost, the prophet Isaiah is approached, and he gives a response that's very surprising. You notice he doesn't say, you will conquer, you will win, Hezekiah, you will fight, you will prevail, Hezekiah. No, he says, the Lord says to the God of Assyria that you will not even enter this city. You will not shoot an arrow, nor advance a shield in it, nor will you heap up a siege ramp. You're going to make no advances whatsoever on the city. And not only that, but you will flee back to your home, to your capital, where you will die. Well, according to 2 Kings 19, this prophecy was speedily fulfilled because a plague went right through the Assyrian army the next morning, destroying it and leaving Sennacherib outside the walls, slinking back to the capital, to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, to meet a well-deserved death at the hands of his own sons. This is how God drove Sennacherib away and defeated this incredible power on behalf of the people of Judea. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty intrigued about this story. I'm wondering, why did God let Sennacherib come right up to Jerusalem's door before he defeated them? Why did he let this unstoppable force advance right to the edge of victory? I'm sure the folks in the 46 conquered towns would have asked that question. They thought the fight was over. Lachish fell. Everyone in Jerusalem said, we are next. There's no way. Defeat seemed inevitable. But after hearing of Assyrian victories and atrocities, it must have been really hard for the people of Judea to have faith. It must have been hard for Hezekiah to have faith. They were raised to worship other gods under Ahaz. They were used to sacrificing their children to Moloch. Perhaps they thought, maybe it's time we turn to our old gods because the God of Israel is not doing too well right now. He's let all these other cities fall and we're next. Maybe we need to go back to our old gods. But they didn't. And even Hezekiah, who worked hard faithfully, who prepared for the inevitable, and who trusted God, must have wondered at this last moment, how are we to be saved? Are we going to be saved? Can we prevail? What lesson does this have for us? Well, I've been thinking about the old saying, you've probably heard it, we're not really sure who said it first, that the Christian should work as if it all depended on him and pray as if it all depended on the Lord. I've been thinking about that, especially these days as we're going through some real trying times, being under kind of quarantine, and for so many months, 10 months, 11, I don't even know how long it's been now, but we have been consumed with this threat of getting this terrible coronavirus. And some of our dear friends and family members have died because of this. I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about how we're called to use our intellect, we're called to use our strength. Hezekiah was asked to defend his people, to come up with resources for them, to prepare for a siege, and he did that. But inevitably, it was God who provided the victory. He worked as if it all depended on him, and he prayed as if it all depended on God. I think that's what we're being asked to do right now. We're being asked to listen to the wisdom of doctors and medical people who say, stay away from people who could be contagious. You don't know. Wear that mask. Do the social distancing. Avoid being in company of others. That's the wisdom. And then the prayer. Because ultimately our victory over this coronavirus, over everything that is around us that might cause us to fear, depends on the Lord. And if the Lord can chase away one of the largest known armies of that day from this vulnerable people under Hezekiah, he can do that for us too. So I'm trusting that as this Christmas season, you will do that. You'll work as if it all depends on you. You'll pray as if it all depends on God. And we will see victory. I care about you a great deal, and I pray for you all every day. And I look forward to being reunited victoriously with you. God bless.